part of the 125th birth year celebrations of PC Mahalanobis, our founder, fondly remembered here as PCM, or sometimes as Professor of Counting and Mathematics, Counting and Measurement, Counting and Measurement. So for those of you who are unaware of who Mahalanobis was, he was truly remarkable, one of the more remarkable individuals in sort of modern India. He made very substantial contributions to the theory of mathematical statistics and economics. He wrote a growth model which was the foundation of the second the second five-year plan. And I read an interview by of the Japanese economist Hirofumi Uzawa, who actually said that that a lot of multi-sector growth theory was inspired by this paper. Mahalanobis was also a key policy maker, in modern India, and a great institution builder, and we are here because of him. And not only did he build the Indian Statistical Institute, but he gave it a vision and a direction and purpose. And that vision was basically of using statistics and economics for the purpose of nation building, of a young nation. So it's particularly fortunate that we have this opportunity to remember him. Also like to thank IGC, the International Growth Center, and the platform Ideas for India, which is supporting this conference and organizing a session this evening. I hope many of you will be there. Also like to thank the CSH, the Center for Human Sciences of the Embassy of France, which is sort of hosting a dinner tomorrow, the conference dinner, and also a roundtable session. Finally, let me say that this conference is getting bigger and better every year, more participants, and it's all possible due to the efforts of a single individual. So all the success can be attributed to a single individual, and that is my colleague Trideep Rai, who personally handles all emails, makes the program, deals with caterers, the requirements of the ministries, and 1,000 other problems which arise all in the last minute. So a special thanks to him and our secretary Deepmala and our student volunteers. So at the outset, we should thank them. Finally, in the manner of Roman emperors, I can say, let the games begin. And I now, Bharat will take over.
Thanks. I'm Bharat Ramaswamy. I'm the chair of the session. So today we have speakers who need no introduction, so I'm not going to offer one. And we have the familiar Dixit Stiglitz pairing, but we'll go in the reverse alphabetical order just to give you some credit. So we'll start with Professor Stiglitz. We have 45 minutes for each presentation, so maybe about 35 for your presentation and 10 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. There's a real pleasure being here again at ISI. The topic that they asked me to talk about is some joint work with, is it? Okay. What? Oh, okay. Yeah, good. With Anton Kornek, a paper that we gave earlier at an NBR conference. And as I go through, some of you will recognize it's very similar to a presentation I was giving yesterday by, what? Okay. Well, and we'll hopefully have some discussion about that. It should be obvious that there's a very deep concern about joblessness and wages inequality. It's played a very big role in political life in the United States and Western Europe. But it's also important here in India, where in one recent period it was reported that while you created 1 million new jobs, everything in India, the numbers are large, it was in a period where there were 49 million more people entered the labor force. So the challenge of creating jobs, even if you succeed in high growth, remains. And just to plug a new book of mine that came out, some of you know about my Globalization and its Discontents, that was written about the discontent with globalization associated with the developing countries. I wrote it after I left the World Bank. And there's now a lot of discontent with globalization in the United States and Western Europe. A belief that it has contributed to both inequality and joblessness. And with Trump saying that globalization has been unfair to the United States. And obviously, my previous book said globalization has been unfair to developing countries. How do you square, I wrote this book partly to answer the question, how do you square these seemingly contradictory statements? And so I won't tell you more about it. You'll have to buy the book, which you can get at Penguin here, should be able to get here in Penguin in India. And I'll talk about globalization towards the end of my talk, but this talk is focused on technological change, but you can think of globalization, the 2 points. One is that a big debate in the United States is about what is the relative importance of globalization versus technical change. But what I want to try to argue here is actually the intellectual framework from thinking about the two is actually very similar. So what I'm going to try to do is try to present an overarching framework for thinking about these issues, a few results about on the particular notion of artificial intelligence. The important notion of artificial intelligence is just that it highlights the ability of machines compared to humans. In the past, machines were stronger than humans. They could do things that we couldn't do. But artificial intelligence suggests that actually machines can actually think better than us. And in terms, and therefore represent a much more serious threat to workers' well-being. I'm going to try to argue that the key issue is about redistribution, that it's not a threat if we have instruments of redistribution and the politics of redistribution. I'm not going to talk about the politics, but I'm going to try to talk about it in terms of the instruments of redistribution. There's some alternative perspectives. Many people think that AI is more likely to be IA, that is intelligence assisted, so that it will increase productivity of labor and make us more effective in what we do. But this talk is focusing on the other notion, that possibility that machines replace labor. So that's what's called human worker replacing innovation. So I'm not going to, I'm just going to assume that it's of a worker replacing nature. And for those of you who used to know a little bit of the earlier literature in this, going back a long time to the work of Hicks, the question is, at a given factor supplies, does this innovation increase or decrease, and current wages, does it increase or decrease the demand for labor? And if it decreases the demand for labor, the new equilibrium will be associated with a lower wage, and therefore workers being worse off. We call it labor saving, Hicks labor saving innovation. So the basic idea is that in a first best world, we have an innovation that moves us from E naught. The zero there is not well placed, but I'm never very good at these things. And that's an innovation I never mastered. So it was supposed to be a research assistant innovation, but it actually, anyway, from E naught to E1. So what you see there is the fact that the competitive equilibrium, this is the utility possibilities curve. It's a simplification, you could do this in n dimensions. You have the utility of the capitalist, and I'm using the word capitalist and innovators synonymously. They could be separate, but we can talk about that. And the utility of workers on the vertical axis. And so what you see there is a worker replacing innovation where the result of the innovation is that workers are worse off. But the way I've drawn it is that it's very clear that there are, in a first best world, we can redistribute income in one way or another, lump sum, but it may not be lump sum, but we have instruments for redistribution that ensure that we could be to the northeast of E naught. And where to northeast is a question of political contestation, but we could make both better off. So even though the AI is worker replacing, in the end, both workers and capitalists could be better off. But another possibility, however, is that move from E naught to E1 is such that we don't have lump sum redistributions. Redistributions are costly, and this is the perspective, for instance, that a lot of the right wing in the United States say you can't redistribute income except to the rich. They think that's a good thing, but redistributing to the poor is very costly. So they would like to move even more further down, and that's what we've been doing in the new tax bill in the United States, giving the capitalists even more. But if we try to ensure that both workers and capitalists were better off, we can't do it. That in that process of redistribution, it's so costly that we wind up there's no way we can make both capitalists and workers better off. The important point about this is that there's a sense in which this is not a technological change. It's certainly not a Pareto improvement. And in this kind of a world, workers ought to resist this innovation. And there's been a little bit of controversy in the United States around this theme. Bill Gates, of all people, suggested that we should have a tax on Robux, saying that we shouldn't be moving all the way down there, and we should try to stay to the northeast in some way of E naught. And perhaps not surprisingly, Larry Summers has taken the right-wing position of saying you shouldn't tax Robux no matter what it does to distribution. So that's where a little bit where the political debate is in the United States. Each of those utility possibilities curves represents an outer envelope of a large number of utility possibilities curve for each institutional framework. So I didn't say this is a market equilibrium. I didn't use that vocabulary because there's no such thing as a market equilibrium in the abstract. A market equilibrium has to be defined by the institutions, institutions like intellectual property, corporate governance, a whole set of legal frameworks. Markets don't exist in a vacuum, and you have to define them relative to a particular set of institutions. And so you can think of the utility possibilities curve there as the outer envelope of all possible institutional frameworks. And that's going to be important because changing any of these institutional arrangements gives you greater flexibility in ensuring a Pareto improvement. And I'll go through and particularly give two examples of changes in taxation on capitalists and in intellectual property rights, which make it more likely that one can achieve a Pareto improvement. There's a third possibility that I want to highlight, which is to remind one that there is no first welfare theorem for innovation. That is to say, if you go back to Arrow DeBrew, they assume that technology is fixed. There was a reason they did that. The reason is they couldn't prove it with endogenous technology. You know, it wasn't that they hadn't thought about that issue. It is that there is no first welfare theorem for innovation, which means that in general, innovations do not actually need, even with lump sum redistributions, they may not move the utility possibility curves outward. They can move the utility possibility curves inward. So, and I'll give an example if I have time later on, of particularly in the context where there are market imperfections, like limited ability to reallocate labor, where innovations actually are Pareto inferior. So that's something I'll come back to later. But the important implication of that is intervening in the innovation process may generate Pareto improvements. And as I say, there are lots of examples where you can think of relevant examples where you can think of innovations that have been Pareto worsening. High-frequency trading, I think, has had no social benefits and has actually undermined the efficiency of capital markets. And I have a paper showing how you can apply the Grossman-Stiglitz result to this market and show that high-frequency trading actually is welfare reducing and makes capital markets less efficient. And there is another paper I have where you sort of almost obviously feel that something is peculiar about the market, where we have high levels of unemployment of unskilled labor, and yet we have innovation creating more unemployment of unskilled labor. So, you know, no social planner would be doing that. He would say, right now, where do we want to devote our innovation resources? It would be to saving our planet, not to saving unskilled labor. So, and I'll come back a little bit to some other results on endogenous innovation. So the critical question for public policy is, are there public policies which would ensure that everyone would be better off? And will these policies emerge out of the political process? And so I'm only going to be talking about that first question. And I'm going to use a particularly simple model where we have worker replacing technical change. And unlike the paper that DeBraj gave yesterday, I'm doing it in a very aggregative level, but it should be clear that the microeconomics is very similar, underlying this is very similar to what he talked about yesterday. The two questions are, what does worker replacing technical change do to wages, and what can public policy do about it? And the result is pretty obvious when you think about it, which is that it increases the effective supply of labor. And when you increase the effective supply of labor, that decrease, in the short run, it decreases wages. I mean, it's really that simple. But what we've done here is using Euler's theorem to try to make clear an obvious point that the decrease in wages is offset by an increase in earnings of the capitalist. So to put it another way, adding machine labor creates redistribution towards the complementary factor. There's a pecuniary externality. Those increased earning income can be thought of as unearned rents, and this holds for all factors in the production function. But the important point that I wanted to raise here is that this really brings us much more into the first diagram that I talked about. Because it's unearned rents, you can tax it. The gains of the capitalist are, one can, in this very simple model, tax those gains and redistribute them back to workers. So the very fact that what is giving rise to workers' lower standard of living is this redistribution is a basis then for an ability to impose a non-distortionary tax that can compensate and protect them. Now, the second theorem proposition concerns the Malthusian model world, and there's the singularity that DeBraj talked about yesterday. And the idea is really very, very simple, that if we get better and better at AI, and making machines that replace labor, at some point, machines can reproduce themselves, and you have what had been the major limiting factor in our standard model of industrial production. You know, a standard model of industrial production was capital and labor. Now, and capital was producible, and the non-produced factor in our standard model since Solo's work has been labor. That was the non-reproducible factor. And all of a sudden, what we've done is made labor producible. And that means there's no scarcity. So we solved, in a way, for those of you think back to Keynes' beautiful paper about solving the problem of scarcity. This really goes beyond what Keynes talked about in that paper, The Legacy of Our Grandchildren. We solved the problem, AI solves the problem of scarcity. Well, that's a little bit Panglossian. I mean, it sounds great. And at one level, you can say the standard framework that economists use would say, isn't this wonderful? Even workers are not worse off because at that point their ability, their margin, their margin of product is fixed at a very low level. The capitalists are getting richer and richer. Their workers' share is going to zero, but their absolute income doesn't decline further, and they can be compensated. The fact is that that, I think, is unrealistic in so many ways. I don't know where to begin, but one way it's particularly unrealistic is that actually there are going to be other sources of scarcity. And one important source of scarcity, which economists are beginning to focus on, is land, that we occupy space. And it's, some of you may know, I've been arguing that one of the important reasons that there's a big disparity between wealth and capital is rents, and one of the important sources of rents is land rents. So whatever is a non-reproducible, you can't reproduce land, you can't produce land, whatever is a non-reproducible resource then becomes the major limiting factor and gets more and more of national income because it is the limiting factor. Well, there are a couple important implications of this in Proposition 3. First is that human wages eventually will fall. The owners of the non-reproducible factors absorb all the rents. There may be periods where actually workers get better off before they start getting worse off. But out of this, there are some good news, and that is taxes on the non-reproducible factors are by definition non-distortionary. So what is limiting growth is this non-reproducible factor, land, but we can impose taxes in a non-distortionary way and ensure that the benefits of these are enjoyed by everybody. So the important thing I just wanted to emphasize, what we're saying is that the way of thinking about this is that it ought to be the case that it's this figure, which is what we've argued is the relevant one for AI, putting aside the politics, that the very fact that that there are some non-reproducible factors means that we have the potential of imposing lump sum redistribution. Well, as I said before, there are we want to think of the utility possibility curve as the outer envelope over all possible utility possibility curve for every institutional arrangement. And so the next thing is really to think about different institutional arrangements. And two changes, as I mentioned before, are second best, you might say, are changes in intellectual property rights and changes in capital taxation. And so one of the results is that so long as this elasticity of capital supply is not too large, we can always increase the tax rate on capital and compensate workers. And the other proposition is that there's always some combination of tax rates and patent life that with positive growth rates that can make everybody better off. So we may in fact change the intellectual property regime in ways that diminish the innovation from the level that it might have been And we always do that. I mean, we don't give unlimited intellectual property rights. And this just emphasizes that we can find a combination of tax rates and patent lives with positive growth that makes everybody better off. As I said, there are a variety of instruments that one ought to explore in ensuring that there's a Pareto improvement. And one of the things that the literature on AI emphasizes is that, in fact, the fraction of jobs that are likely to be replaced by machines in the short run is actually limited, and that there are many, particularly service sector jobs, to which our economy is actually increasingly important, things like caring for the elderly is something I'm more sympathetic with, healthcare, education, a whole set of service sectors which are likely not to be easily replaced by machines. So the problem with these jobs is that the value of those services are not really market determined. There are good reasons why these services are associated with the public sector and with public provision and public finance. And so the question is how much we pay for those workers that affects the dignity associated with those jobs and obviously the degree of inequality. And so the theorem I gave before said that we can always impose non-distortionary taxes. And so one of the points is that we can use those non-distortionary taxes to increase the wages we pay for those kinds of jobs. I mentioned before that we ought to think of innovation as endogenous. And there's a well-developed theory of endogenous factor bias, technological progress, going back a long time. And the basic theorems in that relate to the notion that the incentives to innovate, to save labor, is related to the share of labor. So as the share of labor gets smaller and smaller, there should be less and less incentive to innovate to save labor and more incentives to innovate to save the non-reproducible factor land. So in some sense, that ought to be a limiting factor in the process that I described before of replacing labor by machines. Now, I've talked about the long run, but as Keynes again said, in the long run we're all dead. In the short run, the transition that I just described, the transition as we replace labor may not be easy, and there are lots of market imperfections. One set of general result is with mobility frictions and rigidities, technological change can be welfare decreasing. So you can show that the transition out of, say, manufacturing, because that is going to be one of the sectors that will be most affected by AI, may actually lead to a short run in which everybody is worse off in the absence of adequate government intervention. And one can show that one interpretation of the Great Depression was that it was a result of technological change in agriculture, which led to enormous decrease in agricultural prices by 50 to 75%. That decreased their ability to buy urban goods, and both because of the inability to, what would have been could have been a Pareto improvement, turned out to be one in which everybody was worse off. And it was only with World War II that the transitions that were necessary and could not be privately financed. And there's an inherent reason why they can't be privately financed, because the capital of those in the sector subjected to dislocation have their human capital and often their physical capital, their financial capital, weakened, destroyed, and therefore they don't have the resources to address the problem. It should be obvious that this has enormous impacts on inequality. I won't say any more about that. But one of the questions that is often raised is, what about UBI, Universal Basic Income? And interestingly, a lot of people in Silicon Valley are talking about UBI as a solution. It's the way that they want to buy off actually paying taxes. So they think that by giving a pittance to everybody, they can absolve their responsibility. And so that's the solution that they're surprisingly advocating. But the point is, I think not an adequate answer, and here's just my view. Human jobs provide not only income, but also a whole set of other aspects of dignity in the form of meaning, status, and fulfillment. And providing income won't be a full solution to the problem. And government ought to have a responsibility for making sure that people have jobs. I said that globalization can be viewed within the lens I just put forward, and the easy way of seeing that is, the easiest way to see that is think of two countries, two islands, separated with and then an innovation in transportation costs. That allows them to trade in a way that they didn't trade before. That's what globalization is. Now, much of globalization is a change in the rules of the game that allow people to transport, but that's a kind of social innovation. And you can therefore see everything I've talked about here as applying to globalization. And where, again, there are huge distributive consequences. The factor equalization theorem tells us that that full integration is going to have very large distributive consequences, move us from E0 to E1, where workers are actually worse off, and therefore whether globalization is a prey to improvement or not rest on the question about whether you can redistribute. Finally, one of the things that this analysis of AI raises is the possible return of the relevance of Malthusian economics in a very dark way. That is to say, if there are not the compensating redistributions, and if there is this pecuniary externality and the wealthy demand the land as they get wealthier and wealthier, and the well-being of workers gets lower and lower, they will start facing a Malthusian constraint. And in our paper, we talk about alternative ways of addressing these Malthusian issues. Either allowing the Malthusian forces to play out. So one way of thinking about this is, in our standard models, we don't think about the labor supply as being endogenous, but Malthusian models really think about labor supply being endogenous. And the new equilibrium is going to have, it's basically machines crowding out humans. And so the equilibrium with AI will be one in which there'll be fewer normal humans. And that's one. And the other alternative is halting AI. Of course, the preferable alternative, at least in a utilitarian, almost any perspective, is one entailing redistribution. But it raises some very, very deep philosophical question about once you endogenize a population, issues that Edgeworth actually talked about is how do you evaluate, and Partha Dasgupta has talked about more recently, how do you have utilitarian, what is your social welfare function when population is endogenous? Those are actually difficult philosophical questions. So let me conclude. Worker replacing technological change can be unambiguously positive in a first best economy, or if it is coupled with the right form of redistribution that undoes pecuniary externalities that arise in response to rapid innovation in the economy. But in the absence of such intervention, there is a presumption that worker replacing technological change will not only leave workers getting a diminished share of national income, but actually being worse off. And the scope for redistribution is facilitated by the fact that the changes in factor prices create windfall gains on the complementary factors, and that should make it rather easy to achieve Pareto improvements. So one of the things I want to just emphasize is that apart from the politics of what we're talking about, the economics suggest that AI should be possible to make it a Pareto improvement, and particularly so if we broaden the set of instruments to include different institutional arrangements. And finally, the more willing society is to support the necessary transition to provide support to those who are left behind, the faster the pace of innovation that society can accommodate and still ensure that the outcomes are Pareto improvements. But a society that is not willing to engage in such actions should expect resistance to innovation with uncertain political and economic consequences. Okay? Thank you.
Question? Oops. Yeah.
Very exciting. One thing I didn't quite follow was the pecuniary externalities that you mentioned. We've learned that they're not real externalities.
Well, there are two results. One of them is a general one, which the Greenwald-Stiglitz theorem says that pecuniary externalities do matter when there are self-selection constraints, incentive compatibility constraints. So if you learn that pecuniary externalities didn't matter, you have to unlearn that. But the second thing, in this particular model, it's not that sophisticated. This is really very simple. All that I'm talking about is the redistribution. It doesn't matter in that sense from if you didn't care about distribution. But what I was trying to say is it is just a redistribution, and therefore we can redistribute that income. So the point I was making is that workers are worse off, but that redistribution means that we could tax the gains of the complementary factors and therefore compensate the workers and bring them back to where they were, and there'll be something left over. So that we can make both, we could go into that northeast region in Figure 1. So a lot of this, the paper is trying to assess really whether we are in a world like Figure 1 or Figure 2, and trying to argue that or to suggest that there are good reasons to think that AI provides us with a framework that we're in actually A1, but modular, ignoring the political economy, which is something you can't ignore, but it's trying to separate out, okay, here's the economic analytics, and then there's a really important political discussion of the political economy.
Debauchery and I have suggested that one way to redistribute in such situations could be a universal basic share, not necessarily universal basic income, but a share that each country commit, maybe internationally, but commit to a certain share that of the national product as you go to everybody divided equally. And that would give people just as if they had property rights to the robots, and we give much more sort of social cohesion. It can give more collective rationality, in the sense less conflict related to it, and above all redistribution. And you don't have to renegotiate every time, as you would have to do in universal basic income. Do you have any opinion
Yeah,
on
no,
that?
I think that's a great idea. And it also, I mean, implicit when you just said is, it is a partial way of addressing the political economy issue, because it says we don't have to slow down the pace of innovation to protect workers, which is one of the implications I talked about towards the end, that you would have to slow down innovation. This says, no, we'll have a fast pace of innovation, but you'll benefit from that by having a share in GDP. And so I think that is a very interesting way of doing it. Implicitly, what that says is when you're giving a share of GDP, what you're implicitly giving is ex ante a share in technological innovation. It's a property right in ideas that have not yet been discovered. So in a way, what you're saying is I own, the society owns this idea that we have not yet discovered, and I can't specify that property right because I haven't yet thought of it. But I know I will be thinking of it. That's what we mean by innovation. And so the way we do it indirectly is to say that's indirectly measured by GDP, by the delta in GDP. And therefore, yeah, so I think that is a good way of, I don't know whether it's the optimal way, and I don't know, I haven't thought through all the properties, but it is you might say, a good solution. Avinash? Yeah.
A kind of related way to deal with this may be to match it up with the Diamond-Murley's idea that you can separate out the prices that producers face from the prices that consumers face. And basically you can have producers facing, well, world prices or whatever the right shadow prices are, while the prices that consumers face govern consumer welfare, and the differences between them then become the taxes. And there's a whole lot of flexibility in rearranging what prices you face consumers that can be done just to compensate the losers or to give shares or whatnot. Victor Norman and I did this in the context of international trade, how the gains from trade could be Pareto welfare redistributed using only Diamond-Murley's taxation, not lump sum taxation. And it would be worth exploring whether a similar thing can be done in the context of international, in the context of innovation.
Yeah, no, that's actually a very good suggestion. One way, in some ways, changing the life of the patent is an instrument for sharing the proceeds of innovation in the following sense. When the patent ends, competition ensures that prices go down, which means real wages go up, in effect. So everybody gets then the benefit of the innovation at the expiration of the patent. And by shortening the patent life, you the producer price, what the producer gets, that temporary monopoly, is changed, and therefore, and the duration of the benefits in terms of lower prices, the consumers is extended. Now, the reason I mention this is very different from the Diamond-Murley's framework because of the intertemporal nature of the problem, and I haven't thought through exactly how. Okay.
In principle, it should be possible to do Diamond-Murley's intertemporally, the whole price sequence. But it remains, of course, to actually see if it all works out. In
Yeah.
that context.
Yeah, but that basic idea, I think, is right. Is that one wants to ensure, consumers here are the workers, in effect, and so there are the ways of making sure that the benefits of the innovation are shared with everybody, which are the workers. One minor, not so minor issue here is that a concern that you don't want to just focus on redistributions through prices. And the reason for that is those benefits go to those who have incomes. And if in this model here I've destroyed the incomes, AI has destroyed the incomes of workers. So it's very nice that their prices are going down and their income also is going down to, so prices are going down to zero in some sense, but wages are going down to zero, and I'm not quite sure how that works out.
No. I don't think you've fully understood what Diamond-Murley's can do in this context. The wage on the producer side can be zero, but wage on the consumer side, as it were, can still be
right.
possible.
No, you're right about that. Yeah. So that sense, you can have a labor subsidy,
Yeah.
and that actually is an important point. Is that what in the United States right now, among the right, the approach to dealing with the huge inequality in the United States is precisely that. There's a strong support, for instance, by my colleague Glenn Hubbard, was Bush's economic advisor, for a very large earned income tax credit, which is a wage supplement, and actually, tripling wages, they've argued, for low-income workers. So the right has actually been arguing for a Diamond-Murley solution to our inequality problem.
So even Larry Summers might be happy with that.
There are some classrooms, right? There is, we are out of time. Just one last question with it, and then we are.
Regarding the cost of redistribution, what about, I think it's sort of assumed very simply that it's easy or costless to sort of redistribute. But looking at the Indian experience, there's always some kind of tyranny imposed when we try to redistribute resources. It's happened in the past. We've had some kind of license charge. So wouldn't that be a cause of concern? Assuming that the government is benign and it can easily redistribute, whereas it can impose some kind of a tyranny in the name of redistribution, which could be quite costly, actually.
Yeah, well, that's really the controversy between Figure 1 and Figure 2. Figure 2 says you can't easily redistribute, that attempts to move from the competitive equilibrium the market equilibrium, or however you call it, E1 to the northeast of E0 can't be achieved because of those limitations. What I try to argue is that in at least a well-functioning state, that it is possible to impose lump sum taxes, to impose non-distortionary taxes on the gainers that could make sure everybody's better off. But if you don't think you could do that, then the appropriate way to deal with it is actually to shorten the patent life. And by shortening the patent life, you get to what basically you're doing is your shorter patent life effectively means in a, say, a Bertrand competition or a Carnot, doesn't make any difference, that the gains of the innovation get shared with society through lower prices. And the distributive effects become smaller. And so the idea is that there is some length of patent life and some relatively small tax system, which even a country with limited ability to redistribute could manage, that could ensure you that you can get the Northeast. So that's basically the spirit. So what it says is that in a society where you have good instruments and good ways of redistributing, you can have a faster rate of growth, and the more institutional flexibility you have, and by that I mean more institutions that you can create that deal with these distributive consequences and transition issues, active labor market policies, because transition is always going to be costly. The more that you can do things like that, the more confident you can have a faster pace of innovation that's consistent with a Pareto improvement.
Thank you very much.
That's not an issue here. Everybody knows that corruption is an extremely important issue in India and, in fact, in many other countries. The trouble is exactly the opposite. People kind of expect me to present a magical solution that will completely solve the problem, drive corruption to zero, what was it, Bhashtachar Khatam Karo, that kind of thing. And that's not going to happen. Basically because the kind of overview of attempts that I'll go through, I hope will convince you that although there are ways to move forward, there's no complete solution, there's no magical solution. And that's because corruption is such a complex, multidimensional problem. There are degrees and degrees. There's petty corruption of a policeman asking for little bribes. There's mid-level corruption of bribery to get government licenses and contracts, often of sizable magnitudes. There's grand corruption. There's state capture, and a whole lot of things in between. So it needs to be tackled equally multidimensionally. Organizations, coalitions, leaders, all kinds of things have been tried with varying success. However, almost always with less than 100% success, and success in less than 100% of the dimensions. I'm going to look at some of these to see what we can learn going forward in what kind of context. And the kind of things that have been tried range from formal legal system, make laws and enforce them, somewhat independently of the government. There are anti-corruption agencies which some governments kind of deliberately set up and give independence to. There are community associations, which are kind of either non-governmental organizations or self-enforcing groups of people who have realized that they have to take matters in their own hand. And I'll say more about that. And we find that success, even to the extent that success is possible, usually requires multiplicity of these methods acting together. And often building coalitions between government-sponsored organizations and community organizations, different community organizations, etc., around these. We'll also find that there's a kind of synergy between some of these, that having 2 or 3 of them acting together is better than the sum of what's possible using those 2 or 3 separately. I'm going to look through some of these examples based on my reading of other people's historical work, not my own. And then I'll kind of pull some of these strands together into just a little bit of, actually, not theoretical models, unlike, say, the very simple one that I put up yesterday at the Delhi School of Economics conference. But I'll give those concepts that can then be put into models. In fact, I have a couple of papers of that kind. And references can be found both at the end of these slides. If those slides are made available publicly, the very last page of them as references, and the underlying paper can be made available also for the conference and will have references. Very quick summary of the kind of methods that have been used to set the stage for what's coming. There's a mixture between top-down methods, where the top rulers of the country lay down methods, laws, exercising leadership. And then the bottom-up methods, where social movements, civic society groups form and can then build up. Media can play a role by exposing corruption, and that can also then build up into a bigger movement. You've seen examples of both of these in India with mixed success. There's a combination between ex-ante attempts, where you kind of try and select less corruptible people in the right kind of positions, or have deterrents in place that will stop people from trying to engage in corrupt activities, and ex post methods, where if corruption takes place, you are able to detect it and punish those who are engaging in it. And of course, these can be combined in various ways. But ultimately, what's needed is something of a change in the whole culture. Culture in the sense of the whole system of values, beliefs, expectation, behavior, actions in the society. There's a kind of strategic game going on, and some societies have kind of common knowledge that corruption is just a way of life, and you just go along. And then there are societies in which it's regarded as a very bad thing. Engaging in corruption brings a lot of shame or guilt on the people, and those can often act as bigger deterrents than formal legal punishments. So culture can become an equilibrium, and the ultimate idea is to change the whole socio-economic equilibrium from one of corruption to one without corruption. And of course, there can be, at least for long periods, halfway houses between them. So let me begin my quick overview with the medieval Italian city-states. They developed, and it persisted for quite a while, although the historians are not very clear about how it came about in the first place, its development, and why, since it turns out to have been a fairly successful system, why it disappeared. But the research is going on, and maybe we'll have answers. And this was a system of hiring a city manager called a podesta, and a design of a whole mechanism of the contract that the podesta was given with a structure of both carrot and stick incentives. Number of key things here. One was that the manager was appointed from outside the city, had to be hired from the outside. A city resident could not be appointed as a podesta. So he did not have connections inside, he did not have vested interests inside, and the same way, he could not become one. He was hired for a very limited term, often for just 1 year, and brought his own managerial staff with him, also from the outside. He had to pay a deposit at the beginning, and at the end, the deposit plus his contractual fee would be returned, minus any fines that might be imposed on him for mismanagement. You might ask, well, I mean, aren't there kind of opportunism possibilities? At the end of the contract, the city says, no, you did a very bad job, we are not paying you, we are just keeping your deposit, etc. But people forget that all these are ongoing games. The city that tried that would not be able to hire a good podesta next year. And likewise for the podesta, his reputation and possibly being hired by another city in future years would depend on how well he was known to have performed in the previous city. So it's essential to understand the ongoing nature of this process of interaction between multiple cities and potential podestas. Another interesting thing is that the podesta was confined to palace, pretty luxurious kind of place, but couldn't go and mix with the population. Again, the same kind of thing, couldn't develop interests, go to dinner and quietly people offer bribes, etc. That was not possible. And the only thing they were allowed to do was city management. They were not allowed to do any kind of side business of their own or anything of that kind. When they engaged city services, the payments for those went directly to the providers from the beneficiaries. So these are just a few points. The analysis is quite detailed in historical literature. But the key thing is that these people, just like the American founding fathers of the Constitution, seem to have been very aware of human weaknesses, potential misuse of power, etc., and taken all kinds of precautions to guard against that. Okay, let me say a little bit about other European countries. Very often, reforms in them took place after a crisis. So Denmark was defeated disastrously in a war, and that kind of destroyed the power of the aristocracy and led to reforms that ultimately produced a kind of country that we know today. Today, in all kinds of ratings, Denmark comes right near the top, like 99th percentile. And the way I say is things have changed drastically since Hamlet's time, and there's just about nothing rotten in the state of Denmark anymore. The civil wars and revolutions in England and France, frequent theme in a lot of these is what happened was that the power of the aristocracy got broken, and then the king hired people from the bourgeoisie who did not have much outside wealth and were dependent on good performance from directly responsible to the king. This system then gradually got professionalized, the training for these people developed, and that led to what we now think of as a Weberian bureaucracy of people who are trained in a vocation, not just out there to enrich themselves. You may have views on how successful that has been in the Indian civil and administrative services, but it may take a long, long time. There's also some literature on what happened in transition economies after the collapse of the Soviet Empire, and there's a very mixed record. There's a very nice book and some other articles by a woman called Mungiu Pipiri, a Romanian woman, who has gathered together the kind of correlates what's necessary for successful outcomes. And some of the most important things, not surprisingly, are how strong is civil society, how good the participation in civil affairs is from the educated portions of the population, etc. How well freedom of press and speech is maintained, generally transparency, all these things prove important. United States used to be very corrupt in like the mid-19th century, and over decades, over 6 or 7 decades through 1920s and 30s, there was a very substantial drop in the level of corruption. People have studied this. There's a very nice book edited by Ed Glazer and Claudia Goldin, where, broadly speaking, they bring together 3 types of reasons why the change took place. One was that there's attempt at maximizing social welfare, and that was kind of helped by muckrakers, investigative journalists, and the rise of the progressive movement. The second was an interesting kind of private interest capture of the policy process. As deregulation increased competition, one way of competing for some of the enterprises was to show how good their governance was, how clean they were, to enable them to raise more capital. Morgan was one of the leaders in this kind of development, and gradually with the progressive movement, those things got codified into laws that companies should provide audited annual statements, etc., were started out on the private side and became public requirement, legal requirement only later. Then there were political entrepreneurs. The 2 Roosevelts played important roles in this. And interestingly, shifting of welfare payments to federally organized ones led to a decrease in corruption. They were much more objective. And so it turns out it's not true that empowering local governments or local elites will reduce corruption. Very much depends, partly on how well the civil society in the local levels controls and checks and balances the use of power by those elites. And the book argues that all of these 3 things were in operation. They interacted with each other, but there wasn't necessarily any kind of explicit coalition between them. The journalists were not kind of explicitly going to the political entrepreneurs and saying, hey, look, let's get together and tackle this problem together. Let me turn to 2 examples that are held as kind of shining examples of success in controlling corruption, Singapore and Hong Kong, both of which began with extremely high levels of corruption, basically after the Second World War, and pretty much turned on a dime. So in Singapore, there's a big scandal where the police and officials were found involved in opium smuggling, and as a result of that scandal, anti-corruption efforts were started and very strongly supported and led by Lee Kuan Yew after he became prime minister. And this is a real story of a top-down action that through his personality, his speeches, and the actions that he induced, changed the whole condition. They did very little by the way of encouraging civil society support, social coalitions, etc., etc. Later, as Singapore became rich, civil service salaries could be put at a high level, and in fact, they're put so high that losing that position formed a big deterrent, and so that kind of kept people honest, a classic case of efficiency wages in operation. Maybe being small helped. Maybe that's the kind of thing that would not work in a country of even 50 million people, let alone 1.3 billion. But this is a case of basically a single leader saying, we've got to change, and bringing about the change. Hong Kong was a mixture. Again began with scandal, where a very high-level police official was found to have amassed a huge fortune, and when he was found out, he disappeared. He was a Brit, and he went back to Britain, but was extradited, tried, and punished in Hong Kong. And the new governor who came in, Murray McIlhose, formed and gave very strong backing to an independent commission against corruption, which still goes on. Initially, it met with a lot of resistance. The police force still had a lot of corruption, and there were actual fistfights between police officers and officers of the Anti-Corruption Commission. And gradually, the commission won reputation and overcame this kind of resistance. It did encourage and actually establish a whole lot of lower-level systems, social action, educational action. They started to teach little children in schools the value of being good in this respect, why corruption was bad, showing them cartoons, movies, little speeches, etc., etc. So unlike Singapore, the Hong Kong case is a mixed one of interaction between top-down and bottom-up, and formation of coalitions between them. But a caveat to both of these cases, both of these rank very well in the standard corruption rankings. Very little bribery, but they are not clean, open societies. They're very much insider societies, both of them. The insiders get all kinds of advantages. You might call them close to being crony capitalist societies, and indices of crony capitalism rate both of these pretty badly. So being free of corruption is not the same thing as being truly clean. A completely bottom-up movement. Now, this isn't, in a sense, a case of true anti-corruption fight, because this is a fight against extortion by the Sicilian mafia. But you could argue, I mean, you think of corruption as appropriation of public power for private benefit, but then maybe the mafia has enough public power that you think of it as just another government, so it's worth thinking of it in a similar context. So, pizzo was the name for the extortion of shop owners, restaurant owners, etc., that the mafia practiced. And if you refused to pay up, they would burn down your store or kill you, all the kind of standard mafia tactics. 15 or so years ago, a group of very young people in their 20s said, no, we've got to do something. And they started this movement called Addio Pizzo, goodbye to pizza. One morning, suddenly a whole lot of kind of posters appeared all over Sicily, which said that any society that pays the pizzo is a society without dignity. Nothing else. And this was a brilliant, brilliant tactic, because the mafia had kind of made it a part of its propaganda that squealing to the police was beneath dignity. And these people hijacked that word dignity and used it against the mafia. Then very quickly they asked businesses not to pay pizzo and consumers not to patronize establishments that paid the pizzo, and the businesses that signed up with them, they gave them decals to put on their doors. The mafia ranted against these. The recordings by the Italian authorities when they're snooping on the mafiosi, who the mafiosi said, these people are not paying us, pretty soon our people have to do ordinary work, what are we going to do? But they did not burn these places down. They did not kill any of these people because there was power in their big group. The mafia knew that if they hit one of these people, they would basically face strong pushback from the whole group, the whole society, media, etc. How well have they succeeded over the last 12 years or so? Modestly. 10% of the businesses have signed up with them, but the encouraging thing is that so far there's been no retaliation against these. Even the 10% has been enough. And maybe a little bit of a parallel is in the 0 rupee note movement that got going in India. I don't know how well that spread or not spread, where they had standard banknote type things which said 0 rupees against petty bribery. When a policeman asked for a bribe stopping your car, you gave that. And the difference again between refusing the bribe and handing over a 0 rupee note is that the 0 rupee note is making a statement, I belong to an organization. Do something to me, and the whole organization will come against you. It's been found in statistical studies, etc., of the Addio Pizzo movement that newer businesses that are more on the tech side, that employ younger, smarter people, they're more likely to sign up, they're more likely to adhere. And so the hope is that a kind of virtuous circle will get going.
So, sorry, why just 10%?
Oh, no,
if
it's
there's no retaliation, why just 10%?
Oh, but I mean, partly what happens is that the other businesses have just gotten used to the old system. They're owned by older people. They're afraid that banks will not lend them money because the banks fear that their business will get burned down. You need to kind of spread enough confidence. And that's the gradual process. That's part of the kind of thing I was saying, don't expect big changes to happen suddenly.
But it feels more
10%.
like to either no one, everybody pays, and some that
Those are
very
two.
unstable.
Those are equilibria, but the world very often isn't in equilibrium, and the transition from one equilibrium to the other is a slow process that builds up. You convince the most willing to be convinced, then that demonstration will bring along some more, etc., etc. So that's the kind of point that I actually want to make, that getting to 100%, if it ever happens, will take time. Okay, how are we doing on time?
About 5-6 minutes.
Okay, so I'll go a little bit faster and talk about anti-corruption agencies in other countries. This is basically research institute at Princeton that does this kind of work, and Munjio Pipiri's book. They have done a number of case studies of modern anti-corruption agencies and found things that are important for their success. Most importantly, of course, the agency must maintain its own integrity and reputation. It must not have any taint of corruption, otherwise it will very quickly collapse. It's useful to build alliances with parts of the government, with media most importantly, so that if anybody tries to hurt your reputation, friendly journalists will give you the benefit of the doubt rather than the accusers. Civil society coalitions with international institutions like the World Bank, building alliances helps. Educational campaigns, trying to reshape public norms, a bit like the Audio Pizzo movement saying it's beneath dignity to pay the pizzo, changing expectations. They have to have a balance between pursuing big cases and the lower profile strategy of education, coalition building, etc., etc. If they don't bring some big cases, people will ask, hey, what's going on? They're not doing anything. But bring more big cases, you'll get more pushback from the corrupt people. And they should not try and regard corruption as a cancer that you have to cut out to zero and do that at all costs. Rather, they have to think of corruption as being obese. You want to lose weight, you have to do it gradually through a combination of diet and exercise. You have to keep on maintaining that regime. It'll take time. If you lose weight too fast, you'll only gain it back fast. That's the kind of attitude that you should take toward corruption. Okay, that's my kind of quick historical review. Let me very briefly tell you about what I have been thinking on community institutions, what they can do separately from the government, even though a little bit of support from the government is important. And the idea here is that you can't really rely 100% on the government, because politicians and the bureaucrats really are the main beneficiaries of corruption. So it's the business community that's paying out money collectively, although each of them is tempted to get an advantage over the others by paying bribes. And so that's the classic prisoner's dilemma. When everybody does it, they all lose, but each one wants to do it. How do you resolve a prisoner's dilemma? By setting up a system of norms and sanctions. And you have to realize that although individually you are powerless, collectively you are powerful. So if the Adio Pizzo movement collectively can even begin to defeat the mafia, Probably bureaucrats are less of a problem. The mafia has bigger revenge powers. I don't know though. I mean, some civil servants do have really serious revenge powers. Again, these kind of organizations should have the same kind of attitudes that the anti-corruption agencies should. They should not themselves become corrupt. They should not be insider cliques that extract rents. They should avoid false accusations of corruption against anybody, etc. And again, coalition building is extremely important. You should go into public campaigns of all kinds, educational campaigns, generally start building up a culture where everybody thinks that it's bad to be corrupt, publicize the country's rankings in all these international ratings, and develop pride about ranking well on that and shame about ranking badly on that. All these kind of things can be done. I have two kind of technical models, the corruption as a prisoner's dilemma and corruption as a stag hunt game of assurance. Maybe some of that will come up in Q&A, but I'll leave people who are interested in the papers to read that, and I talked about one of them yesterday anyway. Okay, so to conclude, what should we kind of take away for the future? First of all, we should remember that corruption is really a big obstacle for middle-income countries trying to get to higher levels of income. You can get from really low incomes to middle-income levels with relatively poor institutions, but going beyond that is harder. So that's really important for India at this stage, and all these other BRIC-type countries. Can't wait for the government to do the whole job. Business groups should try and take a lead, media, NGOs. Of course, there have been a couple of attempts like that in India, the Anna Hazare movement and Kejriwal, but I kind of suspect that those people were too much idealists and too little good organizers and managers. It's putting together a coalition of people who have the right ideals and the right management skills that's needed. Ultimately, they must change the whole culture of society from a corrupt level to a much less corrupt level. And that's going to be slow. Outcomes will be far from perfect. But don't say, oh, nothing can be done. Don't wait for a 100% solution to emerge, because if you keep waiting and waiting and waiting, the one thing you'll get for sure is 0% progress. So thank you very much.
One change that has happened in the US, you talk about the improvement in the US, that it used to be a very corrupt society. A big change that has happened in the 20th century is the rise of lobbying. And, you know, from 1930s to 1950s, in 1953, I think the Supreme Court decided to only regulate a very, very narrow definition of lobbying. So, you know, it's free speech and so on. So I feel a lot of the bribery has just been legalized in the US. You know, more and more PAC, the revolving door schemes between lobbying and politicians, the fact that PAC money is unregulated. So I'm not sure that I would take the US as an example of low bribery.
Yeah. All this is relative, and if you look at the 190 countries, the US may still rate in the top third, but you and I would still regard that as bad. And yeah, and I agree 100% with you. And the US has somewhat slid backward, not so much in the matter of petty bribery. The policeman will not ask for $50 stopping your car for some pretext. And in award of government licenses and contracts, there's reasonably clean systems of auctions, things like that. It's really at the state capture level, the grand corruption level, that the US has, if anything, slid badly backward. And I think and fear that the results of that will the fallout will come to the US economy and society in the next 50 years or so. In fact, already within the last year, a whole lot of commentators are saying essentially that US is no longer number one, China is number one, get used to it.
Sorry. I just want to go back to that Adio Pizza stuff because it seems so interesting. 10% of businesses must mean hundreds of businesses.
Yeah.
Maybe a couple of thousand,
Yeah.
right? I mean, depending.
Yes.
And if you say that the retaliation against those businesses was practically, I'm sure there was some isolated incidents here and there, but if it was literally practically zero, then I find it extremely surprising as an example of the usual sort of coordination. You know, you're seeing in this sub-game, right, that a whole bunch of guys, nothing's happening to them, right? So it seems to me that there's something more about this movement. I've tried to read it on the phone as you were talking, but it seems something more going on, and I found it interesting but incomplete as an example.
Yeah, no, that's an entirely fair thing. I am, of course, going by both journalistic studies and scholarly studies that I read, and they haven't gone into why this has not happened, but partly just in amateur sociology, top of the head guess, Sicilian society is extremely conservative, and it needs probably stronger evidence than the 10% to persuade a lot of them to go along. So maybe this will happen, but we'll have to kind of wait and watch. They've had 100+ years of mafia extortion and only 10-12 years of Adio Pizza. So if they keep on adding 1% every year, maybe there is an S-shaped curve, it will get faster. But all that's just speculation. Now, was Kala or Joe next? Yeah, anyway.
Okay. I just want to follow up a little bit on a question about the U.S. I think the vocabulary here is important. The fact that we haven't started labeling the mass corruption that occurs through our political system, our legal corruption as corruption, I think is important. But that's related to another thing. Most of what you talked about as corruption is public sector. And if you start thinking about the CEOs taking disproportionate share of corporate revenues for themselves, it's a kind of private sector corruption. And to me, it seems to me that the focus on public sector corruption as opposed to private sector corruption has a tilt to it that I think one wants, I'd just like to get your reaction. And the second question I had is, you mentioned very briefly about some of the global initiatives, and there have been several of these like Transparency International, and in the area of resources, several initiatives. Do you want to comment about the extent to which these initiatives coming from outside have been successful in changing the dynamics within the countries in fighting corruption?
Okay, let me start with the first one first. Actually, there's a kind of related thing that historians of this area have discussed. Under, let's say, medieval or before that monarchies, there was a lot of embezzlement by the king's ministers from the king's coffers. Do you count that corruption? Or do you say that's really a principal agent problem between the king, who basically owns the whole country as a firm, and his agents? Probably most people would say, and a number of these historians say, that it's the principal agent problem. You can't really speak of corruption until the kind of background understanding is that the government is a representative of all the people rather than owner of the whole country. Maybe the same way people think of the distinction between private corruption within corporations and malfeasance with public monies, that that's a principal agent problem between shareholders and managers, top-level management and lower-level management, etc., etc. But yeah, at one level, it all comes together into the whole culture of society. And if this kind of corporate misbehavior is thought to be, hey, that's just the way it is, then that also feeds into thinking of public corruption as just the way it is. So they ought to be linked more than they have been. But there is that little distinction, that maybe the shareholders should be given greater powers to control CEO salaries. I don't know if that will work, but it's the principal agent problem.
Yeah, except when you have societies with wide distribution of share owners,
Yeah.
it is almost like a public good
Yes,
problem.
yes, yes. No, I agree 100%.
One last question there.
Yeah, do you want to just comment about the global
Yeah.
initiatives?
A lot of these are of some use in creating information, but somebody's got to take action based on this. So, country rates badly. What happens? Very often, nothing. At least there's got to be some attempt to regard being rated badly as a very shameful thing for the country, that everybody should do something to move up that ranking. So those are useful for information, but I don't know if they have led to much, if any, action on part of anybody.
Thanks very much. Given your loose definition of corruption at the beginning of your talk, where you described it as appropriation of public power for private benefit, and this discussion about private corruption, I'm somewhat puzzled by the very prominent absence of, say, large-scale tax evasion as a form of corruption. I feel that if your kind of suggestion that corruption will reduce only when large-scale changes in culture happen, I think that has to really be taken into account, particularly in a place like India, where perhaps anti-corruption movements aren't taking traction because properties are paid for in large suitcases, and income, hiding the magnitude of income is very prevalent. So I wonder if you've thought about that or encountered some case studies on effectiveness of that kind of corruption.
Usually people would not do that. I mean, what you are saying is, in some sense, that tax revenue already belongs to the public. It's already public property. But if you evade those taxes, you are using it for private benefit. Much more clear case would be if you are audited and you pay off who is in charge of actually collecting income taxes? I mean, I think of the IRS in the US, but the corresponding body in India, their guy comes to audit you, you give him or her, whatever it is, 10 lakhs of rupees, and he says, all right, I'll just let this slide. That would clearly be corruption. But just tax avoidance, I don't think people will usually regard that as corruption. They'll regard that as crime.
This is my question to you, because if we're discussing CEO pays corruption and there's this legal gray area that exists, certainly tax avoidance, which is clearly in the legal not gray area, is...
Yeah, you could kind of put it in that gray zone, but I don't think anybody kind of regards that as clearly in the corruption basket.
Thank you. Unfortunately, we have to close the session
Yeah.
now. I would like to thank the speakers, the giants of our profession, for really giving a great start to this conference. And we now move to tea.
Of the 125th birth year celebrations of PC Mahalanobis, our founder, fondly remembered here as PCM, or sometimes as Professor of Counting and Mathematics, Counting and Measurement, Counting and Measurement. So for those of you who are unaware of who Mahalanobis was, he was truly remarkable, one of the more remarkable